The fervent Czech nationalism that so deeply informs the music of Antonín Dvořák was rooted in a conventional sense of cultural identification that was greatly magnified by historical and personal circumstances. The son of a butcher and innkeeper, he was born in 1841 in a village just outside of Prague at a time when the aftershocks of the French Revolution were manifesting themselves in movements of national liberation throughout Europe, as smaller provincial and cultural entities renewed their quest to cast off the hegemony of larger powers. The former Kingdom of Bohemia had been under the control of the Habsburg monarchy since 1526, becoming little more than an imperial province after the decisive Czech defeat in 1620 at the outset of the 30 Years' War. This triumph by Austrian and German forces under the leadership of Emperor Ferdinand II ushered in more than 200 years of oppression that included the forced conversion of the largely Protestant Czech population to Catholicism, the exile and extermination of the Bohemian nobility, the annexation of all Czech lands, the installation of Jesuits as administrators of the educational system, and the establishment of German as the primary language in government, literature, and schooling. Austro-German culture dominated the kingdom's urban power centers, while Czech became the primary language of rural peasants. Despite the fact that I have moved a little in the great musical world, I remain what I always was, a simple Czech musician. In this self-assessment made during his final years, Dvořák captured the essentially dichotomous nature of his career. As a musician who was born and raised in the Czech countryside, his strong identification with his native culture would be a consistent, defining presence in his work. And yet his enormous ability and burning ambition drove him to succeed within an environment in which Austrian and German music represented the summit of musical achievement, and he would spend much of his professional life struggling with the challenges that arose from this ambivalence. Dvořák's first professional breakthrough came in 1875, when the impoverished 23-year-old orchestral violist, church organist, and piano teacher was awarded the Austrian State Prize in Composition. The jury included Johannes Brahms, who was overcome by the creativity and mastery he found in Dvořák's music. He won the prize again 2 years later, and then for a final time in 1877, based on a submission of works that included his Moravian duets for voices and piano. Brahms was so taken by these pieces that he wrote to his publisher, Fritz Simrock, to suggest their publication. You will find pleasure in them as I did, and as a publisher, you will be especially delighted with their attractiveness. Dvořák is undoubtedly a very talented man, and poor besides. I beg you to think it over. This suggestion initiated a complicated relationship that would bring Dvořák fame and financial security while embodying all the bigotries and resentments that characterized interactions between native Czechs and their Germanic patrons. Simrock published the duets, but under the German title Klänge aus Mähren, or Sounds from Moravia, and with the composer's first name changed from Antonín to the Germanized Anton, an alteration that became such a bone of contention over the ensuing years that it required a Solomonesque compromise in which the name would be abbreviated to the more ambiguous ANT period. He also didn't pay Dvořák a fee. But the popular interest in these pieces led Simrock to suggest that the composer write something in the vein of Brahms' enormously successful Hungarian dances. The set of Slavonic dances that followed would establish Dvořák's international reputation and generate substantial profits for his new publisher. But their success also created a precedent that would become yet another point of friction. Dvořák rightly saw himself as a composer in the grand tradition of artists such as Beethoven and Brahms, who was fully capable of composing symphonies, operas, and other large-scale works. But Simrock viewed him as someone whose gifts were best suited to writing shorter pieces in which his Czech folk music-inflected style provided colorful forms of musical diversion, works that were, not coincidentally, more lucrative and less costly to publish. This conflict came to a head over the publication of Dvorak's Eighth Symphony. He'd written the piece over a span of just 17 days during the summer of 1889 at his summer residence in Vysoká, a village some 30 miles southwest of Prague. This work, which in its pastoral sunniness appears as an idyll between his much darker Seventh Symphony and his epic Ninth, contains all the hallmarks of Dvorak's greatest symphonic music: abundant lyricism, rhythmic ingenuity, an exquisite sense of harmonic color, formal creativity, a sure grasp of symphonic rhetoric, and a subtle understanding of motivic development. Nonetheless, Simrock was indifferent to the symphony's quality, renewing his complaints that the demand for Dvorak's major ensemble works was in no way commensurate with the costs of their publication. After giving Dvorak 3,000 marks for his Seventh Symphony, a fee the composer knew was a mere fifth of the sum Simrock paid for a symphony by Brahms, the publisher insisted that he could only afford 1,000 marks for the Eighth. But by this point, Dvorak was no longer the supplicant he'd once been. Since 1884, he'd been making regular visits to England, where his works were greeted with an enthusiasm that was unconstrained by the political and cultural biases of Central Europe. In the London firm of Novello and Company, he'd found a publisher eager to both issue his pieces and pay amply for the privilege. To Simrock's chagrin, Dvorak began to offer his larger works to Novello, and thus his Eighth became the only one of his mature symphonies to lack the German publisher's imprimatur. Simrock threatened to sue Dvorak for breach of contract, and the relationship between the two men suffered a rupture that lasted the better part of 3 years before the chastened publisher reached out to the composer. But Dvorak had proclaimed his independence, and he freely expressed his fierce nationalistic pride in writing to his longtime patron. "Do not mock my Czech brothers, and do not condescend to me either. Your political comments are as entertaining as they are badly informed. Let us hope that nations which possess and represent art will never perish, no matter how small they are. Forgive me, but an artist also has his country in which he must have firm faith, and for which he must have an ardent heart."